excited to be joined by Steve Nielsen today. Steve is the Senior VP of Baseball Operations here at Prep Baseball Report, and he's someone that used to cover Wisconsin. So, Steve, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, you bet. Excited to be here, David. Appreciate it.
I remember seeing you in the watching games constantly at the Rock and everything. You were really pivotal, not only in just being part of the Wisconsin coverage, but then even starting it. I think it was probably about 10 years ago now or more. But before we talk more about that, because I do want to hear more about that, tell us a little bit about your background in baseball, your playing career, coaching career, and what led up to that beginning with Prep Baseball.
Yeah. So I'm a native of Joliet, Illinois, southwest suburbs of Chicago. That's where I grew up, played my high school ball, all that. Was drafted a couple times out of high school and junior college. Then ended up finishing up college at Indiana University. From there, bounced around a few independent teams for a few years, just trying to hang on like most people do, until I realized like real world time is coming. Which at that point kind of was trying to find my footing, still wanted to be in baseball, coaching a little high school, and then got my first opportunity coaching college baseball in Texas. So went down there for 5 years. I coached at Ranger College, Division I JUCO down there as the assistant and then head coach for a few years before the opportunity with Prep Baseball started. It's kind of at a point in my life where like, where's my next either college, step, or keeping coaching, or moving into a different area of the game. And this opportunity around scouting came up and back in my kind of hometown area. So, it was a great opportunity at the time. Always grateful to Sean Duncan for the opportunity. And my old high school baseball coach who had a good connection with him at the time. So, that's kind of how it started. And, starting it, I think that was like 2012, the fall of 2012 when I got the job with Prep Baseball. And at that time I think we were in maybe 5 or 6 states. So it was kind of in its infancy. I think we covered Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, Michigan, maybe Pennsylvania still too at that time. And my job when I came in was to kind of help Sean with Illinois, kind of assist him there, and then start up the state of Wisconsin. So that's kind of my background and how I got to where we were and started up Prep Baseball Wisconsin.
Steve, yeah, awesome that you're able to join this podcast. And Steve, you've been so instrumental in growing the brand of Prep Baseball, not only in the state of Wisconsin, but in the entire country. You have been the boots on the ground. You have been just so instrumental in growing this company, in which I think has been so important for amateur players, again, not only in Wisconsin, but in the entire country, for them to be able to get exposed. And what it has grown to is something that's quite remarkable, something that we never had growing up. And it's so important in the state to have that hyper local scouting presence, watching you play games, watching these kids play games. And it's helped grow not only the popularity of baseball in the state, but it's helped so many different players in the state. I think when you started 2013, there was maybe 10 D1 commits. Now it's over 40 in last year's class in 2024. Talk a little bit, I guess, about just why it's so important for what Prep Baseball does, with that hyper local scouting piece to it, and how it's grown in the state. And I guess just that whole process of how it started and then what it's grown to and how important that process is.
Yeah. I mean, it has grown, as you mentioned. The Prep Baseball Report has grown immensely since I started. As I mentioned, I think we started with 5 or 6 states. Now we're obviously across the whole country. So in my time here, I've seen it go from like 0 to 60 real quick. And I think a lot of that growth, as you mentioned, has stemmed from our like hyper local scouting. Like when I first started in Wisconsin, as I mentioned, I was working it from Chicago suburbs, right? That's where I live because part of my job was also covering Illinois, right? And a lot of the population, a lot of the baseballs around Chicago, even those Milwaukee teams like Hitters early on, GRB, they would come to Chicago and play, the top teams and all that kind of stuff. So I could cover a lot of it from that area. But what I noticed early on is like I needed to get into all these little pockets of areas of the state, right? To see these kids play in their high school seasons, to find these hidden gems that maybe nobody has seen yet. But I think that's what kind of like has helped us grow a lot is our credibility in that, right? So we go out and we're actually going to scout these players. We're going to go see them in games. We're going to talk to their coaches, talk to their high school coaches, figure out what kind of makes the kid tick too. Because when any college coach calls me for advice on a kid or what I got on a kid, I want to make sure I have all of the nuggets I can give him, good and bad, right? Because everybody's going to have warts also, right? There's no perfect player out there. But obviously those are the things that coaches want to know that they think they can either fix or develop when they get to their program. So like, I thought that was very important for me and myself starting out is like getting as much information as I could on players. And I think that's what a lot of our state directors do and why we've grown it so much is we do. We have like so much information on these guys and so much in-depth and information that you're not going to see on the website too, which I think is also very important. So I think that's a big factor of what's kind of helped us grow, and especially in Wisconsin. I mean, I can go back. I'd be remiss to say, too, like a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the stuff that I got on Wisconsin players, I have to give a lot of credit to like some of the OGs of Wisconsin baseball and travel baseball. Like when I first started this, R.J. Fergus with Hitters, Greg Reinhardt, GRB, Sean Smith, Sticks. Like those were some of the guys that I leaned on a lot for information and like pulling up the floorboards on guys like, hey, what's makes this kid tick? What kind of a work ethic does this kid have? Or just giving me names that maybe I hadn't seen yet. Some of the young guys that are coming up that were from some small towns that maybe we hadn't been to yet, or just some areas of the state that we hadn't seen yet. So I think that's a big part of just kind of how we grew specifically in Wisconsin and around the country too.
But also, talk about how important it is for kids to come to a showcase first, identify themselves as a prospect, and then go ahead and follow up as well. So, and when does that process start? 7th, 8th grade now is when we have those Rising Star events.
Yeah. It's funny because like the first event we ever ran in Wisconsin was in January of 2013. And it was in RJ's old place with Hitters, which was in Racine. I believe at the time it had maybe 3 cages in the front, and then they had a little back room where you could pull out a bunch of cages and kind of had an open area where you had maybe just enough room to get pop times. But at that event, we got to see like all of his freshmen, and his freshman at that time was the 2016 class, which was a loaded class. Gavin Lux was the guy that kind of just stood out. I think he was 14 years old maybe at the time and probably weighed 125 pounds, but the dude was like, had the fastest hands I've ever seen. So, getting early, I guess for that aspect, like it was awesome to see that kid develop. And over time, I think part of what we do though, like a little getting yourself to the next level, like we only do so much, right? Like I always like to say, we just shine a light on the players. Like we can't make the players up. Like the player they have to have the work ethic. They have to have the desire, the drive to want to get to that next level, to want to improve, to want to be that player. What we do is basically just provide the exposure to that guy, right? So schools from around the country could see him by a click of a mouse, right? Rather than having to drive X amount of hours to go see the kid. So I think that's it. Like early on, I think getting to a showcase early on, you mentioned like the Rising Stars and stuff like that. I think what the biggest thing with that is it's educational more than anything. Not very many kids are going to be recruited when they're in 7th and 8th grade, right? Back when I first started this, there was a handful right at the time when the rules were kind of like wild, wild west, right? And now not so much, but I think there's a big educational piece. The last podcast I did one with like Go Route, and we had a Q&A like on recruiting and stuff, and parents or kids could type in questions. And just as we ended, one of the best questions that I wish we would have gotten to was, what do you wish you would have known when you were coming up about recruiting and stuff, and what I would have done differently? And I always say, like, being educated, educate yourself on the process. And that's probably step one is exposing yourself to the showcase scene at an early age, because I've seen it several times, especially early days of Wisconsin, where kid shows up, we've got a big event in the summer, top prospect, 20, 30 schools there, and this kid comes up his first time at a showcase, and he's like deer in headlights, right? And you're just not going to perform your best when you're in that situation. So I think getting used to, hey, I got to perform. All eyes are on me running the 60-yard dash. All eyes are on me getting my 7-8 ground balls. All eyes are on me, during my live BP round. And getting used to that environment where like guys are really locked in and evaluating every move you make for those 2 minutes that it's your turn. So I think that's one of the biggest benefits that I see out of the Rising Stars events too, because like they're also smaller. So like guys like yourself, you'll get to kind of interact with the players a little bit more, educate them more. We'll give you a few more reps at something. We'll teach you, give you some tips and tricks of like, okay, here's how you should start and run the 60. Like, here's what we're looking for as scouts, on the infield or catcher or whatever. So it's a lot more, I think, interactive also with, the scouting directors like yourself.
That's awesome. I talk all the time to players about putting themselves in uncomfortable situations, like getting comfortable being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important. And like you said, and you highlighted that.
So you've had a unique perspective in the state where, you started this in 2012 and you've really seen the rise of just the Wisconsin like prep prospect and just how like the high school baseball in the state has gotten better. So just sort of reflect on maybe some of the prospects that you've gotten to watch that are maybe now in the big leagues, like Gavin Lux, like you had mentioned previously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny because like, we always talk like, okay, you've grown Wisconsin or grown baseball in Wisconsin. And I don't think nor us, prep baseball, has really grown the talent level in Wisconsin. Like, it's always been there. I mean, if you just go back in history, like, they just have not gotten the exposure that they have now, right? I mean, Vinny, yourself, right? Like, you grinded your way through Division III baseball in Wisconsin to make it to the big league level. If you were that guy today, you'd probably have easily gotten a spot in a D1 spot, because we would have known you. You were like, this kid's like a grinder on the baseball field, like he's a winner, like all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, you just look back, like there's plenty of names that have been to the big leagues from the state of Wisconsin. I mean, a couple that just come to mind just because of their kids also went right through the time I was scouting, but like a Jared Washburn, Jack Kashner, like those guys and their kids came through when I was scouting there. But I don't think we've necessarily like grown the talent level, right? That's all been on the player and the programs, and like some of those guys I mentioned earlier with the coaching of RJ and Greg Reinhardt, some of those guys that have good programs in the high school coaching, which I think is also really good in the state of Wisconsin. I feel like they've always been there. But the players like you mentioned, Lux, Kelnick, Rorgvet, those guys, those are hard to miss on, right? They stick out like a sore thumb. And those guys were very easily identifiable early on. Like I mentioned, Gavin Lux was at the very first event we've ever ran. And I think it's kind of funny. Like if you've ever had the time to go watch that video, it's pretty funny to watch him as a 14-year-old, to where he is today. Same with Kellenick. I can remember he was always playing like an age up. So he was very easily identifiable at that time. Like he was the youngest kid. He was always an age down from the age he played at. But those guys always had the unique aspects of serious grinders on the baseball field. Like if I could pay them any compliments, it was their work ethics off the field and how bad they wanted to play the game and wanted to reach the highest level that they could, regardless of talent level. Because we've seen it, like that's one of the tough parts about ranking and what we do is like there's talent level up and down the board. Like top 100 players, there's you can separate them, very thin margins in a lot of these guys. But it's what's like in here and in here that is going to separate those guys and get them to that next level. So I mean, I could say that about all those guys. Like I can remember Ben Rortvet is another one. He's big league guy now too.
Verona High School, yeah.
Yep, Verona. When he was 16, 17, first 15 years old, first time we saw him, I can remember Sean and I watching him, and this kid, he had the biggest forearms I've ever seen on the 15-year-old kid. And it was funny because RJ had this forearm machine in hitters, and we were like, always make jokes that Ben would be like living on this machine. But it spoke to the work ethic that he had, right? Because he'd be in the weight room, like all those guys, the bodies on them, like you could tell just by looking at them that they were putting in work, right? So I think that was like the biggest thing that for me, like with those guys that you mentioned, like, and how they maybe improved their stock or how they made themselves stand out to me was always in like the off the field stuff, the work ethic, the desire that they had to get to the next level and be as good as they could be.
You talk, though, too, Steve, and I agree with you. The talent and the athleticism has always kind of been there in the state of Wisconsin. The bigger bodies, the stronger frames have always been here in the state.
Mm-hmm.
But I think not that you're selling short what prep baseball has done. I mean, the fact that we have exposed, and you and Sean, in starting this company, have exposed the players here in the state and other states as well. And it almost gives the players motivation to like, oh, wait a minute. There was 50 guys that were D1 commits last year. And all of a sudden now there's kind of like a snowball effect and some momentum building just around the game of baseball here in the state of Wisconsin. And look, I think that was all on you and Sean Duncan, to be clear on that. Just the exposure and in conjunction with all the bigger indoor facilities that have popped up and the great programs with GRB and hitters and ISA and the other one. I don't want to leave anybody out as well, but I think that is a huge part of how and why it has grown so big in the state.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned snowball effect. That I witnessed firsthand. Like for sure, a snowball effect. I think there was a reckoning, if you will, that like, oh, this is doable. Like I can now get seen by Louisville, Texas schools, Florida schools, whatever it might be. Like it's easier now for me to get seen. And to that point, you mentioned, I think earlier, how many more Division I players committed now versus, previous years. We also, as this transition was kind of happening, had some pushback from like in-state schools, right? Like you can look back at like Division III World Series in the state of Wisconsin, and you're going to see a bunch of names, right? Schools in there, the Whitewaters, Oshkosh, La Crosse, right? Like perennial going to the College World Series in the D3. Like it quite literally traveled through Wisconsin, right? Being in Appleton for so many years. Because of the players that were there. Now they were just they saw like there's more opportunities out there. And some of those coaches I can always remember, like Mike Davenport at Madison would kind of poke me all the time and give me, grief over, all these players that would kind of fall into his lap that would now be, getting exposed to somewhere at the next level. So yes, you're right. The snowball effect, I think, is definitely something that we had a large part in, of like, you could see, and there was a couple of years in there where, hey, it really exploded in terms of like kids getting out there, and we exposed kind of the honey hole, if you will, that was Wisconsin high school baseball.
Yeah, so following up on that, is there anybody that like stands out as guys that you were maybe too low on as a prep and just really took off, like whether it was in college or later on, maybe as a pro?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And for sure in the earlier years. I was talking about, like, I was working when we started this out from Chicago area. So it was easy to see the Milwaukee kids, Madison kids. Like, that's kind of where we focused a lot of my travels to also. So for sure, some of the early misses that, like, I always regret, and this is probably what turned my motor from being like, oh, we can easily cover this from Chicago, like most of the teams will come here, to like, no, like I need to get into all these little areas, smaller schools, that kind of thing, up north. I mean, early on, the Dalton Varsho, who's a big leaguer right now, I just didn't see him in high school, flat out. Like, we had gotten word on him, like got some insight, but personally, like, my eyes just hadn't seen him. The next class, 2015, there was Taryn Vavra, right? Went to Minnesota, got some pro ball under his belt also. Like, he was up there. So Varsho was Marshfield, Vavra, I think Menominee up there. So it was a lot of those. Alex Call in our first ever rankings, 2013. He's a big leaguer. He was River Falls. But again, just guys that I just personally never saw, or didn't get the track record on them prior to that. So that for me was almost like a motivator. Like, these guys, how are these guys slipping through my cracks, right? Like, we got to spread this thing out. And that was before too that we had prep baseball in Minnesota. So like our guys up there, Rob Allison and Judkins, like just of like helping in that Minneapolis area and being able to see some of those guys a lot easier. So you'll see, like, in some of the more recent rankings, obviously like 2016, 17, 18, in those years, we definitely started getting up there more and seeing like the Eau Claires, the River Falls, Bayport, up in the north east kind of area, Kimberly, like those schools where maybe we missed earlier on just because of we didn't see those kids, So it was the misses motivate you, right? Like in anything with sports, I think when you fail at something or you miss something, it makes you want to work harder to get it right the next time.
Yeah, for sure. And it motivates the player as well too. So I talk to players all the time about like our rankings. We try to nail these rankings best we can, but if you're not where you want to be, use that as motivation, right? Use that as fuel to continue to get better. But yeah, that's a really good answer. I mean, surprising, Steve, as hard as you work, that you ever missed on anybody. But totally get it, covering 2 states. That had to be next to impossible. I wanted to, we talk a lot, Steve, and I wanted to get your insight on this as well. And I know you're in a more of a management position with the company. Again, making the company run, basically, really doing a great job, obviously, around the entire country of handling all the different showcases in every single state. I don't think people understand how hard you work and what you do to make everything run here in conjunction with Dunk. But so I wanted to get your take on what we talk about with players all the time, with finding the right fit at that next level. So I do think it's now more important than ever, just because with the transfer portal and the new rules and NIL money and stuff like that. So maybe just give advice, because again, I like getting guests to kind of give their insights on this. Just to reiterate this point, we almost talk about this almost on every podcast that we have a guest on, but talk about, finding that good fit. Maybe if you have an example of a player or two that did find that really great fit from their prep days into college and how they were able to develop at the next level.
Yeah. It's a great point. And, we talked about that snowball effect, right, just a little bit ago. And I can say, and unfortunately, I think it got to a point when, and we mentioned those recruiting rules kind of was wild, wild west. You could recruit as, basically as many guys you wanted. And if you didn't, make the squad after first semester, they could cut you loose, right? So unfortunately, I think some of that we may have overexposed to a bit, and it made it seem almost too easy to get recruited at the Division I level, because we did see, I was mentioning Davenport that early on conversations. I remember telling them hey man, just wait, because a lot of these guys are going to come back to you, right? And they did, unfortunately. There was a lot of kids that went to a Division I school, it wasn't the right fit, and they ended up coming back to a Madison College, an Oshkosh, a Whitewater, whatever it might be. Okay, and we always try to make this point too in our pregame, pre-showcase, if you will, speech, right? It's finding the right fit, right? Academics, where would you go to school if you didn't play baseball, right? What fits you academically? What fits you economically, right? What fits you socially? Those are more important than the name on the front of the hoodie, which I think a lot of kids in that period were simply going to find their next fit based off of how cool the name was on the front of the hoodie, which is not the way you want to go about it. And yeah, there was a few years in there where I realized, man, this isn't going the right way, right? Because kids are now bouncing all over the place. They're not getting in a structure for a few years, right? So I think just finding the right fit is very important. The right coaching staff, what you think coaching staff is going to get the best out of you, right? I think that's important. And nowadays, even as much as players bounce around, coaches are bouncing around, right? So you want to have some stability in a program. And that's one of the things you can definitely say about around the state of Wisconsin, right? There's some long-time coaches in some of these programs in Wisconsin that you know what you're going to get when you get in there, right? You talk about Coach Schwartz over at La Crosse, has been there forever, right? And Oshkosh with Tomaszewicz has been there for over a decade. Even UW Milwaukee, John Wagner just took over, but I think Bigler's still the pitching coach there, right? You've got track records of guys being there for a long time. I think that's important. Also, because you know what you're going to get out of that program. They have a track record. You know what you're going to get out of that coach. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. And like I said, I always try to tell guys where would you go if you didn't play baseball, right? What's the right fit for you? Because at some point baseball is going to end, for everybody, which I know we hate to admit it, but when you're 17, you don't think it is, but at some point it's going to end. And then from there, it's okay. What did I just get out of the last 4 or 5 years, right? What kind of relationships did I build? What did I learn in school? What did I learn on the baseball field? What kind of human did I develop into? So I think those things are all very important and something that cannot go overlooked when you're looking into a program. I mentioned it from the get-go, right? What I wish I knew, I wish I educated myself better when I was that age, right? My parents were great, but neither of them knew anything about recruiting baseball. Neither of them went to college even. So I was a very blue collar family. I just did not know anything about that whole world. And I wish I did. So that's just when you're looking for that good fit, make sure you educate yourself. Educate yourself on the coaches that are there. Educate yourself on the academics of the program, the history of the baseball program. Well, whatever is important to you, make sure you educate yourself on it.
So, Steve, if let's say I were a high school baseball player right now, maybe starting high school in that time frame, that finding the fit and doing research, certainly, I mean, probably the biggest thing. But what other advice would you give me if I were saying, like, okay, well, I want to play college baseball, figure out a good fit for me, and also figure out ways to improve and to be the best baseball player I can? What advice would you give me?
Yeah. I think you have to really dig deep and be like honest with yourself. I think that's a big part of it. And like being honest with your abilities. All right. That's another thing that we always talked about, is be honest with who you are as a player. All right. What you're good at, what you're weak at, which is the hardest thing. Okay. And then go out and get better at what you're weak at. All right. While still maintaining and getting better at the things you're good at. Right. Being able to sell what you're good at. If you guys, when we say you come to a 60 man or come to a showcase and like you're a small left-handed hitter that can really run and like go get it in the outfield, like, well, you might not show up well on like the TrackMan exit velo, but running the 60, like the things you do well, show what you do well, right? Don't try to be somebody you're not. I think that's an important thing when you're wanting to get to that next level. Like, don't try to be the guy next to you, because there's a lot of different shapes and sizes of baseball players. Vinny, I'm sure you can attest to this. Like it comes from like what's in here, like how bad do you want it, how much are you willing to grind at it. I've seen several guys that just fall off or bounce back or whatever just because of their level of grind isn't there. I think that's the biggest thing. We can talk about skills and metrics and all that stuff all you want, but I mean, really, like you've gotta want to be out there like 24/7, 365, right? Live, eat, breathe baseball, because it is a grind of a sport, right? Especially at the highest level.
That's a great answer. I think kids are going to get a lot of value out of that answer. Just really this whole entire podcast. We can't thank you enough, Steve, for being on. I think we're going to wrap with that, but how much insight there was in that. I actually, as long as I've known you, Steve, now for a few years, I learned something, in the last 45 minutes, actually. There's some really good answers in there. We really appreciate you coming on. This is really going to help players, and that's kind of the goal of this podcast. Entertain, yes, but give a lot of really good insights, and you're going to find a lot of those in this podcast and this conversation with Steve Nielsen, who has been, again, just the integral part of what prep baseball has become and how they've helped players over the years. And he's the one that started it all here in the States. So we can't thank you enough for coming on, Steve.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I feel like I could talk about it for another hour, but no, that was great. And I appreciate you guys and everything that you guys have done here over the last several years since I've kind of moved on from scouting and covering Wisconsin. I know, like, as myself, thinking back 7-8 years, whatever, there's no way I'd be able to put together a podcast like this on my own. So you guys are doing a great job, and what you've done for Wisconsin and your passion of the baseball in the state is awesome. So I appreciate everything you guys are doing too.
Well,
thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Well, before we go, we've got a few commits to mention, Rotino report as usual, and then a fun fact to wrap it up. I know we've been a little inconsistent on fun fact, trivia question, but hoping to get back into that a little bit more. So first, want to highlight a few of the players who committed from around the state and congratulate them on their commitments. Killian Helt from Union Grove committed to Edgewood. Kellen Smith, a utility guy from Altoona, committed to UW Eau Claire. He's someone who was a member of our all-state teams here at Prep Baseball during the spring for the WIAA season. Infielder Ethan Scheckler from Fenimore committed to Northeastern Iowa Area Community College, or NIAC. And then, Vinny, you've got a couple commits that you also wanted to highlight.
Yeah, infielder and right-handed pitcher Connor Curtis from Waukesha North committed to UW La Crosse, and catcher Gabe Backhop from Broadhead also committed to UW La Crosse. And thank you for allowing me to announce those, because those are fellow Eagles that are probably going to be on their way to a Division III national championship at some point. Go Eagles.
Yeah, maybe one of them will become the next Vinny Rotino. Gabe Backhop, a catcher too, so someone who could follow in the footsteps of the great Vinny Rotino. And as I said, we also got a Rotino report, someone who's uncommitted that we want to highlight. So, Vinny, who's today's player that you want to highlight?
Yeah, today we're talking about Jacob Koopman, top-ranked 2026 in the class. He is actually currently ranked the 40th player in the class of Wisconsin. He is currently uncommitted. Left-handed arm, 6'1", 180, does a really nice job of getting down the mound, consistent, repeatable delivery from that left side. We had him up to 84 at the Wisconsin State games this last summer and early August, but we have reports that velocity has been ticking up this winter at ISA, and so we are really looking forward to him and what he's going to be looking like this winter at a preseason ID. So Jacob Koopman, 4 pitches for strikes, 3 secondary offerings for strikes, including a changeup, slider, curveball to go with that fastball. So this is one of those kids that you're just kind of waiting for that velocity to pop, and with that athleticism, with that delivery, and with that body, it sounds like that is starting to tick up with that velo, and when it does, on a consistent basis, you never know where this kid is going to end up. Again, currently uncommitted, but Jacob Koopman, the 40th ranked player in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah, and he's part of a great program over at Menasha in the Fox Valley area, up in northeastern Wisconsin. So someone who will be, I feel like you get a little bit of an advantage from playing for those good programs. You play more meaningful games and have the opportunity to develop around some good players. Today's fun fact is about MPS, Milwaukee Public School products, who have made it to the big leagues. And since 1960, there are just 2 MPS products who have made their major league debuts. And the 2 are Alec Marsh, who I don't know if we mentioned him at all in the conversation with Steve, but right in the middle there, 2016, he went to Milwaukee Reagan, and he's with the Royals now. And the other is Bob Euchre, who of course recently passed away, someone that Vinny knew, and he went to what's now known as Bradley Tech. Vinny, I wanted to put you on the spot a little bit and tell us what Euchre meant to you, or just highlight the kind of person that Bob Euchre was, since you did have the opportunity to know him personally. I know we all felt like we did, but we didn't really know him personally, listening to him on the radio every day. But you got the up and close personal interactions with Euchre. So what was Euchre like?
Just an incredible man. He lived just a legend. He was a legend. He just lived an amazing life, right? So he played in the big leagues, and then he went on to become a celebrity, really, on the Johnny Carson show over 100 times, or 100 times, I think it was. I grew up listening to him on the radio, falling in love with the Milwaukee Brewers, listening to Bob Euchre and that iconic voice and his stories that he would tell. And then I got a chance to meet this man as a player in 2005. 2005 was my first big league camp. I was the last man invited to camp. Had 0 chance of making the team. But this iconic celebrity of a man, Bob Euchre, comes into the clubhouse, and he talks to me as if I'm a 10-year big leaguer. That's exactly how he treated everybody. There was no pretensions about Bob Euchre. He thought of himself as a player, wanted to connect with the players, and he connected with me, again, the guy that was the last man invited to big league camp, the last man on the roster. And every single day that I saw him, he said, "Hey, Vinny, how's it going?" And it just made you feel like a connection to him. And again, that's exactly how he treated everybody that he had interactions with. Just an incredible person and an incredible man. I was lucky to have known him, although I didn't know him well. I was lucky to have known him. And again, anytime you hear stories about Bob Euchre, you hear similar things about how he treated people. So something to emulate there with Bob, and I was lucky to have met him.
I'm wondering, Vinny, could we see you maybe wear plaid suits in his honor on Brewers Live this upcoming year?
That is a good call. I know that they did that in honor of Bob Euchre on the plane ride on an away trip. Sometimes they'll have like a theme that they're going to dress up with your favorite football jersey, or whatever it is. And one time, this was a couple of years ago, the Brewers did that when Bob was still going on the road, actually, that they all had those plaid sport coats on. And I saw pictures of it. It was really cool. Well,
if not, then we'll welcome the plaid suit coats here on the Prep Baseball Podcast. That would be, or maybe Fields. Fields, you wanna be that guy?
Oh, absolutely. I'll rock that every episode.
Perfect. Well, certainly someone that I know, even though I guess Euchre was a prep baseball Wisconsin product. Being a former high school guy, we didn't have prep baseball Wisconsin going. Steve Nielsen is not quite that old to have started it before Euchre got to high school, but then made it to the big leagues with his hometown Milwaukee Braves, and I believe was the first local kid to play for the Braves, who were, of course, at that time Wisconsin's lone major league team. So certainly an incredible accomplishment, even on the playing side. Even though I know he joked about it all the time, and Vinny also then followed in his footsteps. We were mentioning before the player, the broadcaster for the local team. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Badger State Ball. If you enjoy our podcast, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I looked, and I think about only 25% of you who watch our videos are actually subscribed. So if you're part of that 75%, join the 25% who is subscribed. If you listen to our podcast on Apple or on Spotify, throw us a follow there, a review. That helps people to find out about our podcast, get the word out. And you can find our work at prepbaseballreport.com/Wisconsin or at prepbaseballwi on X. So thanks again for listening, and as always, let's bring back Badger baseball.